Hello and welcome everybody. We're talking about ecology, and this is the part 2 video where we want to get into food chains and food webs. You may have remembered doing this in grade school. We look at this in much the same way, but with a little bit more complexity and detail, with focus on some of these new vocabulary words that you may not know. All right, so this is again a basic introduction to ecology for the natural science student. So let's talk about food chains. The scientific understanding of a food chain is more precise than its everyday usage. So whatever you know about food chain right now, just put that out of your mind. In ecology, a food chain is a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass. Primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and higher level consumers are all used to describe ecosystem structure and dynamics. There is a single path through the chain, and each organism in a food chain occupies what is called a trophic level. Depending on their role as producers or consumers, species or groups of species can be assigned to various trophic levels. Here in this slide, we have a plant, which is a primary producer or a producer. It makes energy or it makes food, and it stores it in starches and things like that in the leaves, for example. Your primary consumer is this little caterpillar. It will eat the leaves. The direction of the arrow is pointing in the direction of the material or the energy. So the energy goes from the plant to the caterpillar when the caterpillar munches on the leaves. And then we have a secondary consumer. We have a bird that does not eat leaves directly, you see. It gets its energy by eating the caterpillars. So it goes around hunting various worms and insects, and it eats this caterpillar. And then finally, we have the tertiary consumer. We often call this guy the top of the food chain, or the apex, or the the highest, a predatory bird or something like that. Here's a hawk or maybe an owl you could think of, and it's going to attack and eat the bird, okay? So the direction of flow of energy goes from left to right in this diagram, not top to bottom like you would normally think. So let me clarify and explain a little bit better. So this chart clarifies how we label an organism's trophic level with its function in a food chain, okay? So we sometimes say the top of the food chain. That means like the hawk in that previous diagram, and the bottom of the food chain would be like the leaf, okay? So a trophic level number 1 would be a producer. Trophic level 2 would be a primary consumer like the caterpillar. Trophic level 3 would be the smaller bird, which is a secondary consumer. And then trophic level 4 would be the tertiary consumer, would be the hawk in this case. All right, here's an example, just looking at one small little food chain in Ontario Lake. Okay, Ontario Lake is a great lake, bordering the United States and Canada. In many ecosystems, the bottom of the food chain consists of photosynthetic organisms like plants or phytoplankton. Please do not forget phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is a huge producer, okay? And these are called primary producers. The organism that consumes the primary producers are herbivores. Herbivores are animals that eat plants or eat phytoplankton, for example, okay? The primary consumers. Secondary consumers are usually carnivores that eat the primary consumers. And tertiary consumers are carnivores that eat other carnivores. So higher level consumers feed on the next lower trophic levels, okay, and so on, up to the organisms at the very top of the food chain called the apex consumers. In this Lake Ontario food chain shown in this figure, you can see how the Chinook salmon is the apex consumer at the top of its food chain. So the apex predator here is called the Chinook salmon, and I can't read what kind of fish this is on my screen. and that will eat these little mussels, which are a type of a hard shell kind of organism that lives in fresh water, and then this kind of mussel will filter green algae from the water. Okay, so that's a great example of a little food chain. At the bottom of the food chain, remember, are your plants or phytoplankton. Sunlight will interact with this green algae to make it grow, produce energy, and then that gets transferred through the food chain. Now, in reality, food chains are extremely complex. And so that's the problem when using food chains to accurately describe many ecosystems. Even when all organisms are grouped into appropriate trophic levels, like I've tried to do here on this slide, some of these organisms can feed on species from more than one trophic level. Likewise, some of these organisms can be eaten by species from multiple trophic levels. In other words, the linear model of ecosystems, the food chain, is not completely descriptive of ecosystem structure. A holistic model, which accounts for all the interactions between different species and their complex interconnected relationships with each other and with the environment, is a more accurate and descriptive model for ecosystems. And we call those more complicated diagrams food webs, okay? So if we look at this diagram, we can see this green arrow left just to the left of my little webcam image here. This shrimp, okay, can eat other organisms, okay, or it can eat this bottom green colored thing on the right, okay? So it's possible for something to be an omnivore, okay? So bears, for example, will forage for nuts and berries, as well as eat like a small rabbit or something like that. So they are a carnivore, they eat meat, and they're also an herbivore, they eat plants or nuts and berries, things like that, okay? So it can be very complicated. So let's practice here with this food web. We have this diagram here, maybe showing somebody's backyard, okay, or a farm, for example. So they might be growing some carrots, they might have some grass, and they might have some grains growing on a field. And there's known to be various animals going around. So we got rabbits and foxes, mice, owls, birds, and grasshoppers, which remember are an insect, but we also call an animal in biology. Now in this diagram, let's look at the very left. So carrots are primary producers. They interact with sunlight to produce and make their own energy, okay? They are autotrophs, okay? Autotrophs that produce and store energy from sunlight in a photosynthesis process. Now rabbits, look at the rabbit. The rabbits are primary consumers that eat carrots to gain that energy. And lastly, foxes are secondary consumers that eat rabbits. And the autotrophic levels for carrots, rabbits, and foxes would be 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so carrots would be 1, rabbits would be 2, foxes would be trophic level 3. We should also be able to do the same for the other portions of this food web. In real life, food webs are complex. Notice that 3 different animals eat grains. Okay, 3 different animals eat grains. Mice, grasshoppers, and these birds all are secondary consumers of grains. Owls and foxes appear to be at the top of the food chain with nothing else eating them, but later we will talk about decomposers who can recycle the energy back to soil-dwelling organisms. I think I talked about the nitrogen cycle previously, but we'll talk a little bit more about decomposers at the end. All right. So how do organisms acquire energy in a food web? Energy is acquired by living things in 3 main ways, okay? We've got photosynthesis, we've got chemosynthesis, and then we've got consumption and digestion of other living or previous living organisms by heterotrophs, okay? You and me, we fall into category 3. We eat a cheeseburger, which is consuming another animal, another plant. If we talk about the pickles and the ketchup, those are tomato and, cucumber, and also the bread is a grain and so on, okay? And the meat is from a cow, all right? So we consume and then we digest, so we eat that kind of stuff. But we'll learn about other organisms like plants that do photosynthesis, and we'll learn about some bacteria and whatnot that do chemosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So these are the three types. Please write them down if you're taking notes. So photosynthetic and chemosynthetic organisms are both grouped into a category known as autotrophs, and I've defined it here on the slide. These organisms are capable of synthesizing their own food. More specifically, they're capable of using inorganic carbon as a carbon source, like carbon dioxide. Photosynthetic autotrophs, okay, are called photoautotrophs. They use sunlight as an energy source, whereas chemosynthetic autotrophs or chemotrophs use inorganic molecules as an energy source. Now, autotrophs are critical for all ecosystems. Without these organisms, energy would not be able to be available to other living organisms, and life itself would not be possible, okay? Now let's talk about phototrophs. Phototrophs such as plants, algae, and photosynthetic bacteria serve as the energy source for a majority of the world's ecosystems. So again, these organisms get their energy from sunlight. So basically, everything on the planet Earth is solar powered. Sunlight will strike the blue-green algae in this greenish lake here. We have plants that are doing photosynthesis, okay? And there's probably algae in there as well, okay? So all of these things are absorbing sunlight and producing material that other animals can then use as a food source. Now, these ecosystems are often described as grazing food webs. Photoautotrophs harness the solar energy of the sun by converting it to chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADP, if you're taking biology and going into this in great detail. Now, the energy stored in ATP is used to synthesize complex organic molecules such as glucose, starches, other sugars, okay, which is the energy source of the planet Earth, okay? Now let's talk about chemosynthetic organisms. Chemotrophs are primarily bacteria that are found in rare ecosystems where sunlight is not available, such as those associated with dark caves, or this image here at the bottom of a hydrothermal vent at the bottom of the ocean. Many chemoautotrophs in hydrothermal vents use hydrogen sulfide, which is released from the vents as a source of chemical energy. This allows chemotrophs to synthesize complex organic molecules such as glucose for their own energy, and in turn supplies energy to the rest of the ecosystem. Here from this figure we can see swimming shrimp, a few squat lobsters, and hundreds of vent mussels at the bottom of a hydrothermal vent located at the bottom of the ocean where sunlight cannot penetrate at this depth. This ecosystem is supported by chemoautotrophic bacteria and organic material that sinks from the ocean's surface. Okay, so things at the top, phytoplankton or other animals, whatever, die, and then they will slowly sink to the bottom of the ocean and provide food for organisms living down here. One of the most important environmental consequences of ecosystem dynamics is biomagnification. Biomagnification is the increasing concentration of persistent toxic substances in organisms at each trophic level, from the primary producers to the apex consumers. Many substances have been shown to bioaccumulate, including the pesticide known as DDT, which is dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. Now, this was first described in the 1960s by a marine biologist. Now, DDT was a commonly used pesticide before its dangers became known. In some aquatic ecosystems, organisms from each trophic level consumed many organisms of the lower level, which caused DDT to increase in birds, which are the apex consumers that ate fish. Thus, the birds accumulated sufficient amounts of DDT to cause fragility to their eggshells, and this effect increased egg breakage during nesting and was shown to have adverse effects on these bird populations. Now, this Carson, who first noticed this, helped raise awareness about the overall environmental issues as well as the specifics of this pesticide, and therefore the use of DDT was banned in the United States in the 1970s. Other substances that biomagnify are polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, which were used in coolant liquids in the United States until their use was banned in 1979. And heavy metals such as mercury, lead, and cadmium. These substances were best studied in aquatic systems where fish species ate different trophic levels, accumulated toxic substances brought through the ecosystem by the primary producers. Okay? So you know that phrase, you are what you eat? Well, you are what you eat and then some, because you're concentrating these toxic materials, and then the next thing that eats you concentrates them, and so on. So you can see in this little figure, we've got phytoplankton, amphipods, a white suckerfish, an aloe fish, a yellow perch, a rabbit's-foot walleye, and so on and so forth. And the bigger the animal, the more they have to eat to maintain their body mass. So there's a magnification in the amount of PCBs, as shown here on the left of the graph. Okay, and we were able to figure all this stuff out by studying and measuring these different things. So with PCB concentrations, they increase from the ecosystem's primary producers, which are phytoplankton, through the different trophic levels of fish species. And the apex consumer, we called it the walleye, has more than 4 times the amount of PCBs compared to phytoplankton. So generally speaking, if you want to avoid toxic materials, you try to eat things at the bottom of a food chain, not the top of the food chain. So also based on results from other studies, birds that ate these fish may have PCB levels at least 10 times higher than those found in the lake fish. Okay? So that's an interesting consequence. Now, excess phosphorus and nitrogen that enters some ecosystems from fertilizer runoff and from sewage causes excess growth of microorganisms and actually depletes the dissolved oxygen of the water, which leads to the death of many ecosystem fauna such as shellfish and finfish. This process is responsible for dead zones in lakes and at the mouths of many major rivers. And here's a snapshot of the world, and you can see the red highlighted areas where we have dead zones. A dead zone, just to clarify, is an area with a freshwater or marine ecosystem where large areas are depleted of their normal flora and fauna. And these zones can be caused by eutrophication, oil spills, dumping of toxic chemicals, and other human activities. The number of dead zones has been increasing for several years, and more than 400 of these zones were present as of 2008. One of the worst dead zones is off the coast of the United States in the Gulf of Mexico, where fertilizer runoff from the Mississippi River Basin has created a dead zone of over 8,000 square miles. Phosphate and nitrate runoff from fertilizers also negatively affect several lake and bay ecosystems, including the Chesapeake Bay in the eastern United States. So here's the Chesapeake Bay. Those of you who live here in Virginia know where this is, and I want to tell you a little bit about efforts to fix the ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay. So the Chesapeake Bay has long been valued as one of the most scenic areas on Earth. It is now in distress, and it is recognized as a declining ecosystem. In the 1970s, the Chesapeake Bay was one of the first ecosystems to have identified dead zones, which continued to kill many fish and bottom-dwelling species such as clams, oysters, and worms. And this guy's holding up a cluster of clams there. Several species have declined in the Chesapeake Bay due to surface water runoff containing excess nutrients from artificial fertilizer used on land. The source of the fertilizers that contain high nitrogen and phosphates is not limited to agricultural practices. There are many nearby urban areas and more than 150 rivers and streams that empty into the bay that are carrying fertilizer runoff from lawns and gardens. Thus, the decline of the Chesapeake Bay is a complex issue and requires the cooperation of industry, agriculture, and of course, everyday homeowners. Of particular interest to conservationists is the oyster population. It is estimated that more than 200,000 acres of oyster reefs existed in the bay in the 1700s, but that number now has declined to only 36,000 acres. So from 200,000 to 36,000. Now, oyster harvesting was once a major industry for Chesapeake Bay, but it declined 88% between 1982 and 2007. This decline was not only due to fertilizer runoff and dead zones, but also to over-harvesting. Oysters require a certain minimum population density because they must be close to each other to reproduce. Human activity has altered the oyster population and locations, greatly disturbing the ecosystem. Okay, sounds bad, but it gets better. The restoration of the oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay has been ongoing for several years with mixed success. Not only do many people find oysters good to eat, but they also clean up the bay. Oysters are filter feeders, and as they eat, they clean the water around them. In the 1700s, it was estimated that it took only a few days for the oyster population to filter the entire volume of the bay. Now, today, with changed water conditions, it is estimated that the present population would take nearly a year to do the same job. Now, restoration efforts have been ongoing for several years by nonprofit organizations such as the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and the restoration goals find a way to increase the population density so the oysters can reproduce more efficiently. And many disease-resistant varieties are now available and have been used in the construction of experimental oyster reefs. Efforts to clean and restore the bay have been hampered, however, because much of the population entering the bay comes from other states, which stresses the need for interstate cooperation to gain successful restoration. There's different laws and things like that involved. Now, the new hardy oyster strains have also spawned a new and economically viable industry, oyster aquaculture, which not only supplies oyster for food and profit, but also has the added benefit of cleaning the bay. So all these things need to be taken into consideration. Economists, lawmakers, biologists, and so on and so forth. Now, let me talk a little bit more about animals. Most animals also share other features that distinguish them from organisms in other kingdoms. All animals require a source of food and are therefore heterotrophic. They ingest other living or dead organisms. And this feature distinguishes them from autotrophic organisms such as most plants, which synthesize their own nutrients through photosynthesis. Now, as heterotrophs, animals may be carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, or parasites. I'll summarize these on the next slide. Now, as with plants, almost all animals have a complex tissue structure with differentiated and specialized tissues. Now, the necessity to collect food has made most animals motile, at least during certain life stages. So, all animals are heterotrophs and thus derive their energy from a variety of food sources. The black bear is an omnivore, eating both plants and animals, as I've mentioned before. And the heartworm, Dirofilaria immitis, is a parasite that derives energy from its hosts. It spends its larval stage in mosquitoes and its adult stage infesting the heart of dogs and other mammals, as shown here in the figure on the right. It's kind of hard to see there. So in summary, let me just highlight what those vocabulary words. An omnivore is something that eats anything. We talked about bears, raccoons also. Raccoons can attack a chicken and eat a chicken, and they'll also just harvest different vegetables and things. An herbivore is something that eats only plants, such as a horse or a grasshopper. And a carnivore eats other animals, such as sharks, for example, okay? Parasites burden a host to get food, okay? So there's, in humans, there are intestinal parasites and blood parasites. And decomposers eat dead plants or animals. Now, these can be as big as a vulture, as small as a worm, or microscopic like a fungi or a bacteria. Sorry, my webcam there wasn't on the last slide, but that's it for today's talk. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up so other people know, and please subscribe to my channel to let others know that my YouTube channel is a useful science educational content website, okay? Thanks, and have a great day, everybody.